So I wanted to talk a little bit about a hot new device, a hot new phone released by Samsung, the S20 Ultra. And the reason I want to talk about it is because I've been using it. I switched over to this phone. I was using an iPhone for a while. I was using a Pixel phone before that. Well, you know, that's kind of how it goes around here. That's the job. You try a lot of different phones. You figure them out. You figure out the things that you like. You figure out the things that you don't. So I thought it would be cool at this moment, given some initial exposure to this device, to lay it out for you, to give you 5 reasons you might want to get this phone, or at least 5 observations, 5 things I like about this particular device. They're not exclusive to the Ultra. Some of the factors would also apply to the other devices, the S20, S20 Plus. Not exactly, but like Will's using the S20, the regular S20. The number one thing that I like about this phone, having used it now for, I don't know, maybe 3 days, is the display. Now, I don't know if that's surprising to you or not. You probably imagined that would be the case. Maybe you thought I was gonna say camera. The display, I put it at number 1, just because of how big it is. I guess I feel like if you are out there as a smartphone buyer in 2020, you got a budget to support this particular phone. And believe me, it is a budget. Full disclaimer, everything I say here applies to a very expensive phone, but you already know that since you clicked on it. If you want the biggest, baddest display, this is probably it in 2020. At this scale, it's the biggest display Samsung has put on a device, and that includes the Note series, which typically had the biggest displays. So it's got a massive display with very little obstruction from any type of cutout. Of course, we have the single front-facing camera symmetrically in the middle with a small hole punch. It has ultra-high brightness. And believe me, I'm a bit of a brightness aficionado. I'm always looking for the brightest screens in daylight, outside. I pay attention, I'm curious. This one is one of the brightest I've ever used. You add to that 120 hertz refresh, and I've explained this to you in the past with other high refresh rate devices. This has a tremendous impact on how snappy the phone feels when you're interacting with it, how fast it feels, and it won't completely show up to you on camera, but once you get this in hand, it's going to be hard for you to go back to a regular 60 hertz phone. And since the last phone I was using before this one was an iPhone 11 Pro Max, which is a 60 hertz device, the gap, the jump was significant, and it's like, man, look what I was missing. It's not just speed, it's also sort of a smoothness that comes along with that 120 hertz. Now keep in mind, it does use battery, and that has been one of the criticisms of this particular device. Even though it's a big footprint, it has an enormous battery in it. At 120 hertz, if you're watching a lot of video, you're moving around a lot, you're playing games, something like this, you can drain it. It is possible, so just keep that in mind. If you want better battery life, you can toggle back the 120 hertz. But you know me, it's like max brightness, 120 hertz. I want to experience the Ultra in Ultra format. If you care about the DisplayMate stuff, they took a look at this screen and basically ranked it up at the top tier. So you put together the resolution, the size, the 120 hertz refresh, Samsung's history and delivery of OLED displays, the tiny little hole punch. You just add it all up, the high brightness, and I think you probably have the most compelling display, if we're strictly talking displays, maybe on any smartphone right now. This all depends on whether or not you're in the market for the biggest, baddest display, because it is a huge phone. So I could see some people maybe with a smaller hand, or you just don't want to have a beast in your pocket. You just say to yourself, I can't handle it, I'm not going to do it, or maybe you don't have the budget for it. So I hear you when it comes to that as well. Will is one of these people. He decided to go for the S20 standard edition. He's been customizing it. He absolutely loves it. All right, number 2, this is a weird one, and it does apply to every single new S20, or, well, the latest Samsung stuff in general. One UI, the new One UI. This is crazy. I can't imagine myself saying this, in fact, because you guys have heard me on here before. I've been a huge proponent of the stock Android experience, the Pixel Android experience, the Android experience the way that Google intended it. This is one of those rare circumstances where I feel like Samsung has actually made an improvement, and that improvement applies specifically to this Ultra model because of how big it is. So Samsung thought a lot about one-handed usage, and as you can see, I can drag from this point in the screen and get my drop down. If I go up to the settings area here, I can grab from anywhere and bring it down into a more reachable location. Now this is my left hand, so the grip is a bit more abnormal, but this is especially important on a really big phone, that there's thought that went into how are you going to use this thing with one hand, and are there software improvements we can make that are going to make your life a bit easier. Now this same thing follows through to Samsung apps and settings. So the default will be sort of like this, but what if I have to reach connections in one hand? Like, check it out. Right now I can reach it, but the default would stick it at the top, making it further away from me. This matters on a device that's this massive. The whole thing is pretty clean. There's a dark mode baked in. It's snappy, it's not a heavy skin. So it's kind of crazy. I'm sitting here using One UI instead of an alternate browser in 2020. That should go to show you, from a guy who's been on the vanilla experience and talking about it for so long, that's meaningful. Now keep in mind that particular point applies to any of the latest Samsung devices and not just the Ultra model. And it's kind of surprising. I put it at number 2, but I don't know, I feel like it deserves to be talked about. It's a differentiating factor that Samsung has if you were cross-shopping this against something that was a non-Samsung flagship device. All right, the next one, this stood out to me right away considering the last Samsung device that I used would have been back in the S10 days. They got rid of the dedicated Bixby button, which to me was an annoyance on the previous models. Now I know eventually you could map these things, those buttons, to do alternate things, but I just hated the idea of having this feature forced upon me when, you know, I'm a Google Assistant guy. I like to use Google Assistant. Bixby was never a replacement to Google Assistant for me, so I didn't want this button reminding me that Samsung was wishing and hoping that I would be using Bixby. I feel like he's back into chasing his tail now that he's wearing the thing. So yeah, I was one of those guys. I was trying to disable and remap the Bixby button, and it was okay. That was a decent substitute, but it just felt unnecessary, and it was just hard for me to get it out of my psychology that this button represented Bixby exclusively. And sometimes I would press it accidentally, and then in the initial way that you would disable it, you could still launch it by double tapping. It was just, I just wanted to be rid of it. And they did that on this device, which is, it means that Samsung's listening to the customer base. And I think that's always a good thing. So now instead, if you head over to the power settings into the side key settings, you can actually do whatever you want, even with the power switch. So if you still want the Bixby situation, you just do it from the power button. It can either be a double press or a press and hold if you happen to be a Bixby user. So that's a better implementation, gives you more control. It's within the One UI. So I just think I think Samsung made the right move there. This is my 4th, and keep in mind, I'm trying to keep it to things that are not obvious. These 5 characteristics that I think will make you want to pay attention to this particular device. Obviously, it's very powerful. It has all this RAM. It has the latest chip from Qualcomm. Of course, it has all those things going for it, but I was trying to keep it more into things you might not think about, or things that I experienced and noticed having the device in hand. So this next one actually has to do sort of with the display again and the flatness of it. Samsung has been through a variety of different curvatures to the edge of the display, dating back to the device that actually had the name Edge in it. That was a very aggressive edge that they had. And they've been playing around, toying around with different versions of it leading up to this one. I think they have finally nailed the right edge in 2020, if you could say that. Now, I know other manufacturers are going bananas with the waterfalls and so forth, but from a person who's used them all, up until this point, there hasn't been the perfect implementation. You would get these unintentional presses on the side sometimes. You would lack a place to grip. They look great. They look very science fiction with the waterfall display, but from a practicality, from a usage perspective, there's still no substitute for a confident grip. So this particular curvature still diminishes the appearance of a bezel, but it keeps it flat enough that there's no unintentional presses. And if you pair a case with the device like I have here, it's even less likely that you're going to touch where you don't want to, because now you have this nice substantial section that you can grip onto, as you can see right here. Now, of course, this is a thin case, so it doesn't obstruct the original grip too much. It's not a massive impact, but it just gives you a little bit more to hold on to and gives you less likelihood of interacting with the edge at all. I think they have nailed the curvature for now. All right, now I can't talk about the S20 Ultra without talking about the camera. It's a very important component here. It's massive, it's standout. It's the first thing you see with this device. If I pull this out of my pocket, people are gonna talk about this camera. They're gonna know right away what this phone is because of the camera. Now, the camera has been a bit controversial. So it might seem odd to you that I'm saying it's one of the top 5 reasons to consider this phone. Controversial in the sense that there's been some issues. Samsung saying, oh, there's gonna be some improvements on the camera. We're gonna have some next software. There's been some issues with autofocus, been some issues with image processing. So these are things you could address with software, but there's also this argument that you shouldn't have to ask for that. It should be out the gate, out the box, maximum performance. But Samsung gives you access to a full-out pro mode on here, which can eliminate a lot of that post-processing. The reason I put it at number 5 is because of camera versatility, which I think is where this particular device shines. Where out of the box, Samsung gives you more control over how the camera operates compared to other manufacturers. There's just so much that you can modify within the camera app. The same thing applies to the video mode, which goes all the way up to 8K. Plus, there's still no real perfect substitute for optical zoom. It performs better than the other zooms, particularly the digital zoom that the Pixel tries to do, at least up to around 10x, certainly at 8x. You're gonna get more sharpness, less software guesswork. This is an area where the hardware is still outperforming even the best software in the world at trying to figure out what a zoomed image should look like. The wide angle camera, I've been using it outdoors. I've been impressed with it, posted a couple pictures from it. So the selfie camera is also very good. So that's why I decided to title it Camera Versatility. It's a mixture of the available settings, the various video formats, stuff in there that you may never use, but that you have access to if you want to dive into it in an ultra model phone. As far as the autofocus stuff and the image processing stuff, we're gonna have to wait and see how Samsung addresses it. If upcoming software can improve it, it probably can, but just keep in mind that it may progress or change over time. My last one is an honorable mention, and it also applies to all the various Samsung devices. And if you caught the most recent video, then you're already aware of it, and that is Samsung DeX, which allows you to plug this horsepower into a laptop or desktop style environment with a keyboard and a display. And I haven't experimented with it before, and it actually turns out to be a totally usable thing. It's surprisingly powerful and fluid, and I can see a lot of people in the future transitioning to a workflow like that. Other manufacturers haven't progressed in this space very much. Huawei has their thing, then you have Samsung with DeX, and then pretty much no one else is there yet, or they're currently working on it. So it's a nice advantage if you're going to invest in a very expensive flagship device to know that you could have the option of plugging this into a dock, getting a keyboard and mouse and monitor experience, or a laptop style experience if you need to do more work, type a document, and so forth. And again, advantage for Samsung. So that's 5 points plus 1 extra, the honorable mention with DeX. Will, is there anything you want to add? You've been using the S20. What is your one favorite thing, one reason why a person should get an S20 series device?
The 120 refresh rate.
Oh, okay.
I think that makes such a big difference.
The display.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's so smooth.
Yeah.
There's no lag whatsoever for this. So yeah, I appreciate something like that.
You're going to feel like you've kind of progressed into the next era of smartphone displays, maybe even more so than resolution, maybe even more so than the advancement to OLED. The refresh has just had a really weird impact on how you perceive the snappiness of your phone, the responsiveness, because of the touch input, the way we interact with phones, that instant following of your finger, it gives the device more life. It feels more responsive to you. This all sounds very extreme and very personal and intimate, and that's because it is. So that's 5 reasons and an honorable mention for me that you might want to get the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra. And that's one reason from Will to get an S20 series in general. It's a moment. You're gonna have a moment.